Beloved child, you came before me with a very long list. You did not call it a list, but I saw every line clearly what they need to change, what they need to understand, what they should have done differently if they truly loved you. You carry those lines with you each time you pray. They sit beneath gentle words, beneath requests that sound right and beautiful. You say you only want what is good, that you only long for healing, that it hurts you to see them continue in what is wrong. But while you are reciting that list to me, I am not focused on each item you name. I am watching the way your hands tremble as you wait for a response. I am watching your breathing each time you send a long message and then set your phone down. I am watching a heart stretched tight from holding everything together. You come asking me to fix them, but what I see first is that you are carrying a role that was never assigned to you. You have grown used to carrying their moods, carrying their silence, carrying even the empty spaces they were meant to face themselves. You say you do this out of love, and I do not deny that. But I also see that you have learned to love by placing yourself in the role of regulator in the relationship, the one who smooths, who adjusts, who explains for both sides. You message when you are unsure. You wait when you are exhausted. You explain even when your heart has already said there is nothing left to explain. Each time, you come back to me and ask, please make them understand. You do not realize that while you are asking me to work in them, you are overlooking what I am trying to do in you. I do not fault you for bringing that list before me. You are not wrong to long for what is good. You are not wrong to hope that the one you love will become more mature, more gentle, more honest. But there is a very subtle misalignment you have not noticed. You have made their change the condition for your peace. You have told yourself without ever saying it aloud that if they changed a little, you could breathe. If they understood a little more, you could be at peace. If they corrected one thing, you could remain without pain. You never spoke it, but your heart has lived that way every day. And so each time they do not change, your peace is pulled out of your hands, as if it never truly belonged to you. I speak this to you slowly and gently, because I know how easily you blame yourself. Your prayer is not wrong in direction, but its footing has slipped. Peace is not a reward that arrives after someone else becomes better. Peace is not a forecast based on another person's behavior. Peace is the ground beneath your feet, not the sky ahead of you. When you stand on that ground, you can face storms without collapsing. When you stand on that ground, you can wait without dissolving. You have tried to stand on fragile signals, a promise, a gesture, a silence interpreted hopefully. But I did not create you to live by predictions. I created you to live by presence. Your peace does not come from believing they will change. It comes from knowing that I am here, right now, with you. At times you think that if you stop praying for them to change, you will become selfish. You fear that if you stop trying, you will be the one who gives up, the one who does not love enough. But I tell you that there is a holy boundary in prayer that you must learn so you do not wear yourself down. You may intercede, but you may not live out their responsibility for them. You may bring them before me, but you may not carry the choices that only they can make. I have never given you authority over another person's will. The authority I have given you is to be faithful to the truth I have placed within you, even when that truth requires you to stop. I see the moment you begin to realize this. It does not come as a loud revelation, but as a small ache in your chest each time you are about to send yet another explanatory message. You pause. You hesitate. It hurts. Because for the first time, you see how long you have been trying to live someone else's part. That realization is not comfortable. It saddens you, because you understand that you cannot love someone into maturity on their behalf. But in that brief pain, you begin to stand back on your own ground. You stop spilling over your boundary. You begin to keep water for yourself. I am not taking love away from you when I say this. I am only removing the illusion that love means controlling, fixing, holding everything together so it does not fall apart. Love is not control. Love is standing in truth without twisting it in order to remain. When you stop bringing me their list of things to fix, you begin bringing me your real heart, and I can touch you there where you are no longer straining to be worthy, but simply standing still to be held. There are days when you come to me without a clear list anymore, yet a quiet question lingers inside you if you stop asking for them to change. Will everything slip from your hands? You do not voice it, but I hear it in the way you sigh when an evening passes without a message, in the way you reread old conversations to reassure yourself that things were once very different. You think you have let go somewhat, but deeper still, you are holding on to something else, the belief that your peace must be anchored to an external outcome. And there, again, I meet you, not with accusation, but with truth. I tell you that your prayer was never wrong in its longing. It was wrong in its anchor. You stood on hope, stretched thin, like a fragile wire, each misstep on their part sending you reeling. You lived by forecast. Today they are like this. Tomorrow they may be better. Today they are silent. Perhaps they are just tired. Today they hurt you. Maybe tomorrow they will understand. You did not see that each forecast was slowly draining the life from you, because it required you to stay tense at all times. Peace is not born in that tension. Peace is not a reasonable conclusion after enough analysis. Peace is what holds you upright when every signal remains unclear. You became accustomed to measuring your peace by another person's reactions. When they softened, you softened. When they withdrew, you unraveled. You thought that was deep love. But I tell you that it is love lived without ground beneath your feet. You were not created to live as someone constantly testing whether the ground will collapse. I have given you another foundation, quieter, steadier. That foundation does not shift with anyone's mood. When I invite you to stand on it, you do not lose your capacity to love. You only lose the habit of panic. There comes a moment when you begin to feel this clearly. It is when you pray and no longer feel the need to explain everything to me. You stop arranging your words carefully. Stop trying to make your case airtight. You simply say that you are tired. You simply say that you are afraid. And in that moment, you do not hear me promise that I will change them immediately. You only sense that I am there close enough that you no longer have to grip anything tightly. Peace does not arrive as a surge of feeling. It comes like cool ground beneath trembling feet. It does not excite you, but it keeps you from falling. I know you once believed that if you stopped hoping for their change, you would become bitter. You feared that if you stopped waiting, your heart would close. But I tell you that hope and dependence are not the same. True hope does not exhaust you. True hope does not demand that you trade away your sleep, your self-respect, or your inner voice. True hope allows you to love and still breathe. When you place your peace in me, your hope is purified. It is no longer a cord that binds you to outcomes, but a light sufficient for you to take one step at a time. I see you beginning to learn this through very small details. There was a time when you did not rush to ask me to change them, but simply asked me to keep your heart at peace for that day. There was a moment when you read again a verse saying that my peace will guard your heart and your mind. and you realize that guarding does not mean changing circumstances, but standing watch so that anxiety does not take the throne. You do not yet understand everything, but you begin to feel it. And once you feel it, you no longer have to force yourself to believe. I did not remove you from that relationship the moment this understanding came. I did not make everything immediately clear, but I began to shift your point of support. Before, whenever you did not receive what you hoped for, you would ask me to do something in them. Now, you begin to ask me to show you where you yourself are standing. This shift is subtle, but it changes the way you are present entirely. You no longer stand waiting to be pulled up. You stand knowing whose hands you are in. At times, the old fear returns. You wonder whether praying less for them means you have given up. But I remind you that giving up is abandoning truth, while what you are learning is to stand in truth without coercion. You are not closing your heart. You are simply no longer opening it as though you must prove something. And it is precisely in this release of effort that peace finds room to remain. I do not ask you to stop interceding. I invite you to intercede from a different place, not from lack, but from being held. When you pray from there, your prayers no longer carry the scent of fear of loss. They carry the steady breathing of someone who knows they are not alone. And whether they change or not, you are no longer swept along. You remain still. You breathe. You know that the ground beneath your feet does not depend on anyone else's steps. As you begin to stand more firmly in me, another truth slowly comes into view, one you previously avoided. Not everything you called a loving responsibility was truly yours. You were accustomed to filling gaps. So when I stopped you, the emptiness felt like loss. But I call it a boundary placed correctly. You thought boundaries were meant to divide. But in my kingdom, boundaries keep the water from breaking its banks. When you no longer overflow into what belongs to others, the water within you becomes deep enough to sustain your own life. I tell you that prayer does not give you permission to cross that boundary. You may bring their name before me, but you may not take on a role I never assigned you. Some choices can only be made when a soul stands on its own before truth. If you stand in their place, you only delay the moment they must face it. I do not need you to manage another person's growth. I need you to be faithful to the light I have placed within you, even when that light exposes things you do not want to accept. You begin to understand this not in moments of strength, but in moments when you are too tired to keep controlling. One evening, you intended once again to ask me to change them, but the words would not come. You simply sat there, and in the silence you realized that if everything continued unchanged, you would continue to unravel. That realization hurt. It struck directly at a long-held belief that loving meant enduring just a little more. But at that very point of pain, I drew a clear boundary. You are not permitted to destroy yourself in order to hold on to something I am not holding for you. I did not sever you from love when I said this. I only severed the confusion between love and control. You once believed that if you were patient enough, generous enough, prayerful enough, they would change. But I tell you that change cannot be forced from the outside. No matter how sincere the prayer, and when you try to live their part for them, you do not help them mature more quickly. You only wear yourself down slowly. Love is not living in someone else's place. Love is standing where you belong and allowing each soul to answer to me for their own part. At times, you fear that if you stop carrying the weight, you will grow cold. You fear that if you keep boundaries, you will lose your soft heart. But I remind you that a soft heart is not the same as a heart without banks. A river without banks is not free, it is destructive. flooding everything in its path. I teach you to keep banks so that your waters do not drown you. When you keep your banks, you still flow, but you flow in the right direction. I lead you into another truth. Difficult, but necessary. You are not responsible for whether they choose truth or not. You are responsible only for whether you walk in the truth I have shown you. When you hear the inner voice telling you to stop, yet continue out of fear of loss, you step outside your own ground. I do not punish you for that. I simply wait to remind you to return. And every time you return, even slowly, I am there. You remember an old story you once read about a sower. Not every soil produces the same result. The sower is not asked to turn rocky ground into fertile land. The sower is only called to sow at the right time and release at the right place. I tell you this so you may understand that intercession does not grant you control over outcomes. When you try to grasp the result, you step out of your role. And when you return to your rightful place, you feel lighter, even though circumstances have not changed. I do not promise that keeping boundaries will spare you from pain, but I promise that this pain will not lead you astray. It is the pain of awakening, not the pain of repetition. You hurt because you see clearly, not because you are blind. And in that clarity, you begin to stand firm. You no longer ask me each day when they will change. You begin to ask me what you need to be faithful to today. This change is small, but it marks a profound turning within your soul. I see you standing at that boundary with two feelings at once, sorrow and strength. Sorrow, because you realize you cannot save anyone from their own choices. Strength, because for the first time, you are no longer carrying that responsibility. You stand there, trembling, yet upright. You have not abandoned love. You have abandoned the illusion that you must be God in someone else's life. And when you stop doing that, you begin to hear my voice within you more clearly, not as a command, but as a confirmation that you are standing in the right place. There are moments when you call me silent. You do not say it in words, but in the heaviness that settles in your chest when you finish praying and everything remains unchanged. You were accustomed to a clear rhythm. You prayed, then waited for a sign. You spoke, then expected a shift. When that rhythm does not occur, doubt creeps in. You wonder whether I hear you, whether your prayers are ignored, whether you have asked in the wrong way. But I tell you that the silence you sense is not emptiness. It is depth. It is the place where I am working at a level your impatience cannot reach. You have grown used to measuring my presence by external changes. When circumstances shift, you believe I am acting. When everything stands still, you think I have stopped. But I do not live by that measure. There are things which, if I did them quickly, you would misunderstand about yourself. There are doors which, if I opened them immediately, you would walk through without realizing what within you still needs healing first. So I remain. I stay still, not because I do not hear you, but because I am keeping you from running forward with the same old operating system. I tell you that my silence is not refusal, but a very quiet form of protection. When you are still standing on the fragile ground of outcomes, I do not give you more momentum to launch yourself faster. I slow the rhythm so you can recognize what you are standing on. You think I am being slow, but in truth, I am preventing a deeper fall. You do not see this right away, because you are looking ahead, while I am looking beneath your feet. There are days when you pray with great sincerity, yet when you stand up, your heart still feels heavy. You carry worry through the whole day, carry scenarios that have not happened, carry endless what if questions. You think this proves your faith is weak, but I tell you it only shows how long you have lived by tension. I do not fault you for that. You survived that way. But now I am teaching you a different rhythm, the rhythm of remaining in me even when there is no answer yet. When I do not change circumstances immediately, I am changing the position from which you stand within them. Before, whenever something felt unstable, you stood at the edge of the cliff, looking down and trying to calculate how far you might fall. Now I am drawing you back a few steps, not so you cannot see the cliff, but so it cannot pull you in. You still see the problem, but it no longer fills your entire field of vision. That is my quiet work in silence. You once believed that if I truly loved you, I would make everything clearer, but I know that external clarity does not always bring internal peace. There are things which, if I said them too early, you would grab onto like a flotation device instead of allowing me to become solid ground. I do not want you merely clinging to promises. I want you to learn how to stand in presence. That is why I do not always answer you with words. I answer you by staying. There are evenings when you sit alone. Nothing special happening, no event, no turning point, no great story. Yet you notice that your inner world no longer churns as it once did. You still think about them, but the thought no longer triggers panic. You still have not seen what you are hoping for, but you no longer have to force yourself to believe just to survive another day. That is a very small sign of what I am doing. You may not call it a miracle, but I call it restructuring. I am loosening your habit of needing to understand everything immediately. You have lived by explanation, explaining to others, explaining to yourself, explaining to me. You believed that if you understood enough, you would be at peace. But I tell you that peace does not come from understanding everything. It comes from knowing you are being held. When you begin to allow yourself not to understand and yet remain, you enter a very new territory of faith, a territory without strain. You have been used to praying as an emergency response. When trouble arises, you rush in, speak quickly, ask urgently, then return to the old rhythm of worry. I do not criticize you for that. You did the best you knew how, but now I am inviting you to come to me not only when there is fire. I am inviting you to remain even when things are only smoldering. It is precisely in that remaining that I begin to change the rhythm of your heart. My silence does not withdraw care, it changes the form of care. I am not standing far away watching you struggle. I am standing very close, so close that you do not hear me because your own breathing is still too fast. When you begin to slow your breath, you will realize I have never left. I was there from the beginning, keeping unseen things from breaking you before you were strong enough to see them. I do not need you to believe that everything will turn out according to your expectations. I only need you to believe that even when things are not okay yet, you are not alone. When you accept this, silence is no longer frightening. It becomes the space where I am rebuilding you from the inside, layer by deep layer, so that when you move forward again, you are no longer walking by old fear. There is something very difficult for you to accept in this season. I am not rushing to answer you in the way you expect. You are used to prayers leading to some visible movement, however small a message arriving, an apology spoken, a softened attitude. When these things do not happen, you begin an inner dialogue, wondering whether I am testing you or whether you have not prayed sincerely enough. But I tell you that I do not measure your heart by the intensity of your asking, nor do I work by the urgent rhythm of fear. There are prayers which, if I answered immediately, would cause you to misunderstand the source of your peace. I see clearly how you try to keep everything from falling apart. You do it by thinking more, by scrutinizing every sign, by anticipating reactions so you will not be caught off guard. You believe this is wisdom, but I tell you that a very deep fatigue has been accumulating in your soul because you have lived too long in a state of vigilance. I did not create you to live as a guard standing watch over other people's emotions. When I do not change circumstances right away, I am removing you from that guarding role. You call this silence because you do not hear the answer you are waiting for. But in that silence, I am speaking to you in a different language. I am teaching you to recognize the difference between peace and numbness. Before, when things were temporarily calm, you called it peace, even though your heart was still strung tight like a wire. Now I am leading you into another state. You still do not know what will happen, but your heart no longer has to tighten just to endure. That difference is subtle, but it is the foundation of what I am building. There are mornings when you wake up and no longer feel the urge to check, to probe, to predict. You are surprised that this calm does not come from everything being resolved. It comes while things are still unfinished. You hesitate to call it a miracle, afraid it might disappear. But I call it the first sign that I am changing the rhythm of how you live. When you stop demanding immediate certainty, you open space for me to work more deeply. I know you once thought that if I were truly present, I would reassure you more clearly. But I do not want to reassure you with promises that only soothe fear temporarily. I want to remove fear's foothold altogether. And to do that, I need you to remain in the unclear space without running off to rescue yourself. My silence does not force you to endure. It invites you to loosen your grip on control. You have been used to praying as though each prayer were a negotiation. You ask, then wait for a sign to know that I have heard. When the sign does not come, you ask again. Explain more. Promise more. I do not fault you for this. You learn to survive by not allowing anything to fall into emptiness. But now I am letting you taste a different kind of emptiness, one that is not threatening, one that is held. In that space, you are not abandoned. You are being covered. I begin my work in you by changing the way you respond to uncertainty. Before, whenever there was no answer, you would fill the space with anxiety. Now, you are beginning to fill it with presence. You may not yet have a name for it, but you feel it when you can sit still without needing to do anything more to deserve peace. You no longer come to me only to ask for an outcome. You remain with me because you need to remain. There are moments when you fear that this silence will last forever, that I will never say what you need to hear. But I tell you that I do not withhold truth from you. I choose the timing so that truth does not break you. If I speak too soon, you will hear through fear. If I wait, you will hear through steadiness. I do not delay because I am indifferent. I wait because I am building strength in you, so that when you hear, you can stand. You begin to notice that there are days when nothing seems to happen, yet you go to sleep without being exhausted. You still think, you still remember, but you no longer have to battle every thought. This quiet is not loud, not performative. It is like an inner room being slowly put in order, not by throwing everything away, but by placing each thing where it belongs. This is the work I do in silence. I do not require you to understand why I choose this way. I only invite you to trust that when I am not speaking, I am still working. When I am not pushing, I am holding. When I am not changing circumstances, I am changing you. And that change, even if you cannot yet name it, is preparing you to stand more firmly before what you will face later. There is a very subtle moment you do not recognize at first, but I see it clearly the moment you stop waiting for me to speak in order to confirm that you are on the right path. Before, you needed a sign, a clear answer, something strong enough to lean on and continue. When I did not speak, you became unsettled, but gradually, within that very silence, you begin to stand more steadily without needing words to hold you. This is not because you have become harder, but because you have begun to place your weight where it truly belongs. I tell you that there are things that can only be learned in silence, not the silence of abandonment, but the silence of presence that needs no proof. When you stop measuring my love by how often I answer according to your desire, you enter a deeper level of relationship with me. At that depth, you do not need constant reassurance to know you are held. You begin to realize that the fact you are still here, still breathing, still not swallowed whole by fear, is already an answer. You have grown used to thinking that if I were truly acting, everything would have to change more visibly. But I tell you that not every change requires noise. Some changes happen like roots growing underground, unseen, unheard, yet when strong winds come, it is those roots that keep the tree from falling. I am doing the work of roots in you. I am anchoring you deeply in what cannot be shaken. So you are no longer swept away by every small disturbance from the outside. There are days when you feel empty, not because of a specific loss, but because you are no longer being fed by the familiar rhythm of tension. You once lived on anticipation, on suspense, on hope mixed with anxiety. When I remove that rhythm, you feel strange, even deprived. You think you are losing your fire, but I tell you that you are not losing fire. You are losing your dependence on fever. I am exchanging it for another flame steady, warm enough, one that does not burn you from the inside. I see you beginning to respond differently to quiet spaces. Before, every silence made you question what you had done wrong. Now, there are moments when you still feel uneasy, but you no longer rush to conclusions. You do not immediately run to fix, to ask, to explain. You allow silence to exist without instantly filling it. This does not weaken you. It matures you. For only those who are truly secure dare to remain with what has not yet been explained. I tell you that I do not use silence to test your devotion, but to return you to the proper rhythm of one who is loved. You do not need to do more for me to remain. You do not need to pray better, believe harder, or understand more deeply to deserve being held. When you stop striving to reach a state of being good enough, you begin to realize that I was already there from the beginning, and that realization softens you in a way that is not forced. There are moments when you are surprised that you no longer react as intensely as before. A delayed message no longer makes your heart drop. A careless word no longer immediately collapses you. You are not without sadness. You are simply no longer led by it. I am doing this work not by making circumstances easier, but by making you steadier. And because this steadiness is quiet, you may overlook it if you are only watching for dramatic signs. I know you once feared that if I did not speak, you would go the wrong way. But I remind you that you do not walk alone. Even when you have not yet heard clear instruction, my presence is still adjusting you from within. There are steps you do not need to decide through reasoning. You only need not to return to the old rhythm. Each time you do not react according to old habits, you are moving more rightly than you realize. My silence is also teaching you something essential. You are not the center of every movement. Before, you believed that if you prayed enough, if you held on tightly enough, everything would change. Now, You are beginning to see that some processes do not revolve around your effort, and this realization, rather than diminishing you, lightens you. You no longer have to carry the burden of controlling outcomes. You are invited back to your portion: faithfulness, presence, and truth. I do not end this silence with a complete explanation. I do not need to. What I need is for you to be calm enough that when I speak, you will not hear through fear. And when you reach that place, you will understand that silence is not an empty space between two words, but the very ground where I am rebuilding your foundation. When that foundation is firm enough, whatever I say afterward will not shake you, because you have learned how to stand in me even when I have not spoken a single word. When I begin to shift you away from your old anchors, you cannot name what is happening. You only feel a strange instability. What once gave you something to cling to no longer feels safe. Yet what I am inviting you to stand on is not yet familiar enough to calm you. You think you are losing direction, but in truth, your foundation is being changed. Before, every breath you took was tied to their reactions. Now, I am loosening that rhythm from their hands and placing it back in mine. This loosening is not loud. It is like standing on new ground before your feet have learned to trust that it will hold. You once believed that what you were asking for was love, but I see deeper and know that what you were truly seeking was safety, not safety from obvious danger, but safety from the feeling of being abandoned, left hanging, placed in a state of waiting without knowing the outcome. And so you learn to anchor yourself to them, to their words, to their attention, to small signals that reassured you that you were still being held. I do not blame you for this. You did what you knew in order to survive in a world full of uncertainty. But I tell you that anchoring yourself that way does not hold you. It only pulls you along with every shifting wind. When I invite you to place your footing in me, you think I am taking away the last thing you still have to hold on to. You fear that if you no longer look to them for safety, you will fall into emptiness. But I tell you that this emptiness is not a pit. It is ground you have never stood on long enough to recognize. False safety comes from believing that they will remain stable. True safety comes from knowing that whether they are stable or not, you are still being held. From a distance, the two may look similar, but they are entirely different in how they nourish your soul. There comes a moment when you begin to recognize this difference in your own body. Before, a single off-rhythm signal was enough to tighten your chest, send your thoughts racing, and drive your hands to control the situation. Now, those startled moments still come, but they no longer carry you away immediately. You are able to pause for a beat. You breathe. You feel the ground beneath your feet, not because everything has become clear, but because you are no longer standing on projections. I am teaching you a kind of safety that does not depend on what tomorrow may bring. I tell you that true safety is not the absence of risk, but the knowledge that you are being held even while risk remains. You have long believed that if you loved skillfully enough, patiently enough, prayerfully enough, you could reduce risk by making others more stable. But I tell you that this is not your work. Your work is to stand in the truth I have shown you, even when that truth is uncomfortable. When you stand there, you no longer need to constantly adjust yourself to avoid an imagined collapse. You once lived as though peace would come only after every piece had been put in place. I am teaching you that peace is the ground on which you place the pieces, not the reward at the end. When you stand on that ground, you no longer rush to conclusions. You no longer scrutinize every gesture to measure love. You no longer explain away silences. You still notice. You still feel, but you no longer panic. That absence of panic does not make you numb, it frees you to see more clearly. I see you beginning to learn this through very small things you once did not consider spiritual. An evening when you choose not to reopen an old conversation, a moment when you hear an inner nudge to rest, and you obey it without self-accusation. A morning when you wake and do not immediately scan for something that must be fixed. These things may not look sacred in the way you once imagined, but it is precisely there that I am resetting your axis. You are learning to live from safety, rather than running in search of it. I do not take away your capacity for hope when I change your point of support. I only remove the kind of hope that keeps you tense. True hope does not require constant vigilance. True hope allows you to love without holding yourself in a state of alert. When you place your hope in me, that hope is no longer a promise of a specific outcome. It is trust that whatever the outcome, you will not be abandoned. And that trust begins to soften very deep layers within you, layers you did not realize you had been clenching for so long. At times you wonder whether feeling more at ease means you are slowly giving up. You fear that if you are no longer tense, you will no longer care enough. But I tell you that care is not measured by the level of anxiety. You can care deeply without exhausting yourself. When you stand on true safety, your care becomes cleaner, no longer mixed with the fear of loss. And it is that clarity which helps you see what belongs to you, and what you must return to me. I am shifting your footing little by little, not so you fall into nothingness, but so you learn to stand without clinging to anyone else. You have not completed this journey, and I have not asked you to understand it all. I am simply inviting you to recognize that there is a kind of safety that does not come from human stability, but from my presence. When you begin to touch that safety, even faintly, you have stepped onto a different ground. And that ground, unfamiliar as it may feel, is holding you more securely than you realize. As I continue to change your footing, you begin to notice something difficult to put into words. You have lived by external signals for so long that you no longer distinguish between emotion and truth. Before, when they softened, your heart settled and you called it peace. When they pulled away, your chest tightened and you called it insecurity. You assumed these states reflected reality, but I tell you they were only waves. Waves can tell you the wind has shifted, but they are not the ocean floor. You lived too long on the surface without knowing there was a deeper, steadier layer beneath one, not shaken by every small movement. I see your confusion as familiar signals lose their power over you. There are moments when they are silent and you no longer rush to fill the space. Moments when they say something that disappoints you, and you do not collapse at once. You do not feel pleased by this. You feel uneasy. You wonder whether you are becoming cold, or whether something inside you is fading. But I tell you, nothing in you is fading. I am only turning down the noise so you can hear a deeper rhythm. True safety does not excite. It does not make you feel as though you are winning. It comes so quietly that you may mistake it for emptiness. Yet because it does not stimulate, it gives you room to rest. You have been accustomed to a kind of safety that required constant confirmation, a question answered, a promise repeated, a gesture reaffirmed. When those confirmations lessen, you think you are losing your foundation. But I tell you that true foundation does not require constant validation, because it does not shift from day to day. I tell you that when you place your footing in me, you no longer need to monitor whether you are loved. This does not mean you stop observing or discerning. It simply means observation is no longer a matter of survival. You no longer read every detail as proof of your worth. You look in order to understand, not in order to save yourself. This change is subtle. but it transforms the way you are present in relationship. You begin to notice that there are days when your heart is calm without a clear reason. No good news. No new certainty. You simply wake and are not pushed into preparing for the worst. That calm makes you suspicious, because you have been trained to believe peace must have a specific cause. But I tell you that true peace does not need a reason. It is a climate, not an event. It exists so that you may live, not so that you may analyze it. When I change your point of support, I am also teaching you to discern the difference between sensitivity and hypervigilance. You have been deeply sensitive to the emotions of others, and you believed that was a gift. I do not deny that. But when that sensitivity is not grounded in safety, it turns into constant alertness. You read expressions, measure tone, anticipate moods, and you grow weary. I am not taking your gift away. I am restoring it to its proper order. When you are safe in me, your sensitivity no longer drains you. It becomes understanding, not an alarm. There are moments when you realize you no longer need to recount everything to me with the same intensity as before. Not because you need me less, but because you no longer come to me in a state of emergency that must be fixed immediately. You come and you remain. You no longer rush to turn me into a solution for a specific problem. You begin to let me be the place where you set yourself down, and in that remaining, I continue the quiet work of resetting your foundation work you do not clearly see. I tell you that true safety does not eliminate risk, it changes how you move through risk. Before, every risk threatened your entire sense of being alive. Now the risks remain, but they no longer consume you. You may still feel fear, but fear is no longer the deciding voice. You begin to have space between yourself and your reactions. That space does not make you numb. It gives you freedom to choose your response rather than being carried away by it. You also begin to see more clearly the places where you once confused love with endurance. When your point of support is me, you no longer have to endure in order to keep someone close. You can love and still speak truth. You can stay without losing yourself, or you can leave without condemning yourself. This clarity does not arrive as a dramatic decision. It comes as a sense of standing straighter when you are in the truth. I do not push you to move faster in this process. I know there are still days when you waver, moments when you check again to see whether you are safe. I do not fault you. You are learning a new way of standing. But each time you choose to return to me, instead of returning to the old point of support, even in very small ways, you are allowing this new foundation to set a little more firmly. And that foundation, unfamiliar as it still feels, is quietly bearing your weight without causing you to collapse. There is a very deep point you reach only after your support has been anchored in. In me, for some time, you begin to realize that what exhausted you was not your circumstances, but the fact that you lived too long in a state of having to keep yourself safe. Before, each day you woke with a part of your mind already on guard. You did not call it fear, you called it prudence. You did not call it tension, you called it responsibility. But I saw clearly the cost of that kind of safety. You rarely truly rested, even when you were in a place of calm. I tell you that false safety always requires maintenance. You must pay closer attention, understand more, adjust faster, sacrifice a little more, and each time you succeed, you feel temporarily secure. But that security never lasts, because it depends on whether others continue to behave as you hope. I do not want you to live by a safety that must be constantly guarded like this. I want you to be safe in a way that allows you to set yourself down without fearing that tomorrow will collapse because of a choice that was never yours to make. As your point of support is gradually placed in me, You begin to notice yourself responding differently to things that once sent you into panic. Not because you no longer care, but because you no longer tie your sense of life to the reactions of others. You can hear an incomplete word without rushing to correct it. You can face a silence without rushing to fill it. In those moments, you are surprised to discover that you remain whole. You do not break. You do not dissolve. And it is precisely this unbrokenness that allows you to begin trusting that another foundation is truly holding you. I see you learning this clearly in the moments when you stop midway. Before, when an anxious thought arose, you would follow it all the way, analyzing, predicting, preparing for every outcome. Now there are times when you notice yourself starting to run, and you stop. You do not force the thought to disappear. You simply stop feeding it. You let it pass like a cloud instead of turning it into the sky. That stopping does not come from rigid discipline, but from the sense that you no longer need to save yourself. I tell you that when you place your support in me, you begin to discern what you can carry and what you must return. Before, you carried anxieties that were not yours, because you believed that if you did not carry them, everything would fall apart. Now you begin to see that some things only collapse when you try to hold them. When you release what does not belong to you, you are not making things worse. You are giving truth room to stand. And truth, even when it hurts at first, does not drain you the way maintaining something unreal does. You also begin to realize that anchoring yourself in me does not make you passive. On the contrary, it clarifies your actions. You no longer act from panic, but from light. You speak when it is time to speak. Remain silent when it is time to be silent. Move when it is time to move. You no longer do everything to avoid a bad outcome. You simply do what is right in this step. That simplicity once frightened you, because you thought it was too little. But I tell you that this very little is what keeps you from exhausting yourself. There are moments when you look back at how you once lived and you feel compassion for yourself. You see someone always braced for impact, always ready to sacrifice one more piece to keep everything from breaking. I do not blame you for that. I know you lived that way because you did not know another way. But now, as you begin to stand on a different foundation, you no longer have to live like that. You do not need to sacrifice your peace to prove love. You do not need to stay tense in order to remain. I tell you that true safety does not harden you. It softens you in a way that does not fear breaking. When you are no longer driven by the fear of loss, your heart can open without placing itself in danger. You can love without losing boundaries. You can trust without blindness. You can hope without hanging your life on an outcome that has not yet come. This is what happens when your point of support is no longer placed where you have no control. You have not completed this journey, and I am not in a hurry. I know there are days when you still test the ground to see whether it is truly firm. I do not fault you. You are learning to stand in a new way. But each time you choose to remain in me rather than run back to the old support, you allow this new foundation to harden a little more. And gradually, you will realize that you no longer need to keep asking whether you are safe. You will know not because everything has been resolved, but because you have been set in the right place. I do not need you to name everything that is happening. I only need you to keep placing your weight where I am inviting you to stand. When you do this, you will discover that true safety does not arrive as a sudden surge of feeling, but as a quiet stability. It does not excite you, but it keeps you intact. And it is precisely within that intactness that you begin to live differently, not from the fear of losing, but from the trust that you are being held, even when you are no longer clinging to anyone else. There is a moment that is very difficult for you to face, because it does not sit at the surface of behavior but deep within motivation. I bring you to this moment not to shame you, but because you are now safe enough to look directly at it. I tell you that some of your prayers are clothed in love, beautiful, sincere, and easy, even for you to accept, yet, at their core, they are driven by the fear of being abandoned. You did not hide this intentionally. You did not even see it yourself. You only knew that whenever you prayed for them to change, your heart tightened, and the fear of losing them remained even after the prayer ended. I do not call this hypocrisy. I call it a soul loving with everything it knows, but not yet free from fear. You learned how to love in a world where presence was uncertain, where affection could withdraw at any moment, where you had to do something to keep others from leaving. And so when you prayed, your prayer carried not only a longing for good, but also a very deep whisper, "Please do not let me be abandoned." I hear that whisper more clearly than the words you speak aloud. I do not expose this to condemn you. I expose it in order to heal. As long as fear remains hidden, it will continue to govern you without your awareness. It will cause you to pray not because you trust, but because you are anxious. It will cause you to stay not because you are called, but because you are afraid to lose. And I do not want fear to rule the most important decisions of your life. My perfect love does not come to reproach you for being afraid. It comes to remove fear from the throne it has occupied for far too long. When I touch this core, you feel a brief, gentle sense of shame, not because you have done something wrong, but because you realize you have been deceiving yourself for a long time. You said you prayed because you loved them, but deeper still, you prayed because you could not bear the thought of facing their absence. That shame does not linger, because I do not leave you there. I place my hand upon you and show you that the fear of abandonment does not make you lesser. It only reveals that you are someone who needs to be held very deeply. I tell you that true love cannot coexist with fear as the one in control. They may stand close for a while, but one of them will govern your actions. When fear is at the wheel, you pray with tension. When love is at the wheel, you pray with trust. I do not demand that you eliminate fear in a single day. I only invite you to notice who is leading you each time you kneel to pray. That recognition alone is already a significant step. You begin to see this clearly in very ordinary details. You rehearse advice in your mind before speaking. You prepare explanations in advance so that if they react, you can soothe things immediately. You thought this was wisdom, but I show you that often it is fear trying to control outcomes. You learn to do things right in order to be loved. When everything runs smoothly, you feel safe. When they err, you rush to correct, not only to help them, but to restore your own sense of stability. I call this your old profession, the profession of repairing other people's souls. You were never trained for it, yet you have practiced it for a long time. You repair with words, with endurance, with prayers carried by tension. You believed that if you did well enough, nothing would break. But I tell you that this is not your role. You were not called to become a repairer of what only I can touch. And when you try to do that work, you do not only grow tired, you lose the joy of loving freely. I do not take love away from you when I invite you to lay down that profession. I only remove the burden of having to make everything right in order to remain. When you stop repairing, you do not become indifferent. You become real. You can speak what you see without needing to ensure the other person responds correctly. You can remain silent without calling it failure. You begin to love without bracing yourself to preserve the image of someone who is always right. always understanding, always accommodating. I tell you that you may still ask me to touch them. I do not forbid that. But before you ask for them to change, I invite you to ask that your own heart be cleansed of its motives, so that your prayer does not become a rope that binds, binding them with expectation, binding you with fear of loss. Prayer is not a way to keep someone from leaving. Prayer is the place where you stand upright before me, without grasping, without bargaining. When you begin to pray this way, there are moments when tears come softly, not because of sharp pain, but because you feel released from a role that has exhausted you. You no longer need to use prayer to hide your fear. You can say plainly to me that you are afraid, and I do not leave you because of it. On the contrary, I draw nearer, and in that nearness, you begin to sense a very different kind of peace. Not peace because everything is resolved, but peace because you are no longer living in the posture of fearing abandonment. I do not rush you through this purification. I know that some motives are deeply rooted, because they once helped you survive. But little by little, as you allow me to shine light not to accuse, but to heal, the fear of loss begins to step down from its place of control, and as it retreats, your love becomes lighter, cleaner, and more real. Not love that clings, but love that stands. There is a very old loop within you that I begin to touch as your motives are brought into the light, the loop of doing right in order to be loved. You did not name it that way. You called it effort, maturity, responsibility. But I see its deeper origin, formed very early, when you learned that acceptance often came only after you behaved correctly, spoke correctly, understood correctly, and caused no trouble. You carried that lesson into love. And so, when others falter, you are not only disappointed, you feel unsafe, as though the ground beneath your feet is shaking. I tell you that it is here you confused loving with fixing. When everything goes smoothly, you feel loved and chosen. When something goes wrong, you hurry to correct it, not only to help the other person, but to reclaim your own sense of safety. You did not realize that each time you fixed, you were placing yourself in the role of being responsible for another person's growth. That role was never given to you. It is heavier than you think, and it quietly drains your life. I see very clearly how you compose your words in advance. You plan each sentence, each pause, each possible reaction. You want to speak truth, but you also want not to upset them. You want to preserve the relationship, yet you want what is right to be named. And so you twist yourself into conversations that have not yet happened. You call it preparation, but I call it a soul trying to keep everything from collapsing by using its own body as support. I tell you that love does not require you to become a soul repairer. You were not created to grind others into a version you believe is right. When you try to do that, you not only carry a burden that does not belong to you, you also unintentionally turn the other person into a project that needs fixing. That does not help them grow faster. It only makes you more exhausted and leaves them more passive. Love is not born from constant correction. Love is born from true presence, where each person must stand before the light for their own portion. I do not say this to make you feel that you have loved wrongly. I know you have loved with everything you had. But I am teaching you a different way of loving, one in which you do not have to do it right in order to be kept. When you stop carrying the pressure to fix everything, you begin to notice a very strange emptiness. You do not know what to do next, because you are used to acting. That emptiness frightens you because it does not give you a familiar role. Yet it is precisely in that space that I am returning you to the position of a lover. not a coordinator. I tell you that there are people in Scripture who also moved through this same loop. They believed that if they did enough, held enough, corrected enough, I would be pleased. But I always brought them back to the same place: gentle obedience, not control. You do not need to carry the responsibility of making others right in order for love to exist. True love is not sustained by correctness, it is sustained by truth. And truth sometimes means laying down the role of repair so that both can face what actually is. When you begin to lay down this old trade, it hurts. Not because you are losing others, but because you are losing an image of yourself that you once believed was good to the one who always understood, always fixed, always kept everything together. You feel empty because you no longer know where you are useful in the relationship. But I tell you that your value was never in making everything okay. Your value is in being present in truth without twisting yourself just to remain. I see you learning this in the moments when you choose not to speak. Not because you are avoiding, but because you recognize that not everything needs to be fixed immediately. Some things need to be left alone so that truth can reveal itself. When you do not rush to correct, you do not lose your voice. You simply give it the right timing. And in that right timing, you feel lighter. You no longer have to prove that you love enough by constantly intervening. I tell you that love does not require you to play the role of making everything safe. When you do, you quietly tell yourself that if you stop, everything will collapse. But I am showing you that there are things which only remain standing when you do not touch them. When you lay down the role of repair, you allow both of you to stand before me, instead of one standing before the other. There are days when you slip back into old habits. You hear the urge inside you to speak, to fix, to explain. I do not fault you. You practice that trade for a long time. But each time you notice it and pause, even for a single beat, you are learning a new way of loving, a way that does not require strain, does not require tension, does not require guaranteed outcomes for you to be at peace. I am not pushing you to abandon all effort. I am simply lifting from you the burden of having to make love right in order for it to survive. When you begin to love without fixing, you will see that love does not grow weaker. It becomes more real. And in that reality, you no longer have to live inside the old loop. You begin to love as someone who is free, not as someone trying desperately to keep everything from breaking. There is a very important step you can only take after you have laid down the work of repair long enough. You begin to see clearly how you have used prayer as a tether. You did not call it binding. You called it hope, perseverance, faithfulness. But I show you that many times you were not praying in order to release, but in order to hold. You brought their name before me. Yet, in your heart, you were still gripping tightly, as if prayer were the final way to ensure they would not leave. I do not say this to frighten you. I say it so you may be free. I tell you that prayer was never given to you as a tool for clinging. When you use it that way, you unintentionally turn what is holy into pressure, and relationship with me into a very quiet form of bargaining. You ask me to touch them, but beneath that you are asking me not to make you face the emptiness if they do not change. And there, prayer loses its upright posture. It bends under fear and you bend with it. I do not blame you for this. I know you have lived through many seasons where loss arrived suddenly. Without warning, you learned to hold on at all costs, even through things that were sacred. But I tell you that anything used to hold rather than to offer will exhaust you. Prayer was created to open your hands before me, not to tighten them around an outcome. There is a moment when you begin to understand this very clearly. It is when you pray and no longer pour all your strength into asking that they stay. You ask me to show you the truth, even if that truth might hurt. That prayer is not loud. It is not urgent, but it is deeply real. And when you speak it, you feel tears fall softly, as though a long-held pressure has just been released. You no longer pretend that you are praying only for them. You admit that you are also afraid, and I do not withdraw my presence when you say that. I tell you that prayer is not a rope. Prayer is the place where you stand upright. When you stand upright, you do not need to use prayer to keep someone from leaving. You do not need to use it to avoid an ending you cannot control. You can tell me that you desire their change, but you no longer bind your life to that desire. You lay your longing down, but you do not lay your identity upon it. That distinction is very fine, but it changes the entire direction of your soul. When you begin to pray this way, you find yourself strangely calmer, not because you are certain that everything will turn out as you wish, but because you no longer have to strain to hold a script in place. You begin to breathe more slowly as you pray. You no longer need to repeat the same request as if enough repetition would persuade me to change my mind. You realize that I do not need to be convinced to love you or to remain with you, and that realization softens you from the inside. I see that you are also beginning to change the way you step out of prayer. Before, you would finish praying and then return to the same tension, the same urge to check, to probe, to fix. Now, there are moments when you finish praying and you stop. You do not rush to do anything else. You do not feel the need to control the outcome immediately. You allow the prayer to complete its work within you first, instead of turning it into fuel for your next action. This is very new for you, and it leaves you both at peace and trembling. I tell you that when the motive is purified, your prayer becomes light without becoming shallow. It no longer carries the scent of hidden desperation, nor the scent of unconscious manipulation. It carries the scent of trust that is growing. You no longer pray in order to avoid a pain that might come. You pray because you trust that I am large enough to hold you, even if that pain is not removed right away. There are days when you notice that you no longer pray for them as much as you once did. For a moment, this unsettles you, because you fear that you are slowly giving up. But I tell you that you are not giving up on love. You are leaving a way of loving that was governed by fear. When fear is no longer at the wheel, you do not need to pray incessantly just to keep your balance. You are standing more firmly, and so your prayers no longer strain the way they used to. I also show you that when prayer is no longer a tether, it begins to open space for truth. Truth about them. Truth about you. Truth about what I am doing that you cannot yet fully see. You no longer use prayer to cover over what you do not want to face. You allow it to illuminate, and when it illuminates, you do not collapse, because you are no longer standing on fear. I am not saying that from now on you will never pray with mixed motives again. I know old layers do not leave all at once. But each time you notice and return to a simple prayer, keep my heart upright before you, you are moving in the right direction. You no longer use prayer to hold on to a person. You use prayer to keep yourself in truth. And in that truth, you begin to sense a very gentle light, not harsh, not forceful, but enough to help you see that you are standing straighter each day, even when you do not yet know what will happen next. A very familiar fear rises in you as soon as I begin to speak to you about boundaries. You do not voice it, but I see it clearly in the way you hesitate. You fear that if you set boundaries, you will be called selfish. If you say this is enough, you will be seen as someone who no longer loves as before. If you stop allowing others to enter as deeply as they once did, you will lose the image of being generous, agreeable, easy to be with. I do not deny that fear. It has walked with you for a long time, because you learned to love by opening the door wide, even when the wind blew through and left you cold. I tell you that boundaries are not walls meant to push others away. Walls are built out of fear. Boundaries are set out of truth. A boundary does not say, "I do not love," but rather, "I know who I am and what I can carry." When you build walls, you shut down and isolate yourself. When you set boundaries, you remain open, but you open with form. You open like a roof, enough to shelter, enough to hold, enough for life to take place without being eroded day by sun and rain. You have lived without a roof for a long time. You thought that was what loving fully meant. You allowed words that made you shrink, silences that left you anxious, invisible demands that slowly drained your strength. You did not call it erosion, you called it sacrifice. But I see every layer thinning in you each time you say it's okay, while your heart is trembling. I do not call you selfish when I invite you to build a roof. I call you courageous, because only the courageous dare to speak truthfully about their limits. I tell you that when you no longer allow yourself to be worn down, you do not become hard. On the contrary, you begin to love in truth. Loving in truth is not always comfortable to hear. It may unsettle others, because they have grown accustomed to stepping farther in than they should. But loving in truth does not cost you yourself. It gives love a shape, a rhythm, a place to stand. I do not ask you to speak truth in order to win. I invite you to speak truth so you do not lose yourself. You fear that if you name your boundaries, others will leave. I do not hide that possibility. There are people who can only remain when you have no boundaries at all. But I ask you a very gentle question: does their staying nourish you? Or is it slowly draining you dry? I do not ask this to force you into a quick decision, but to help you begin to see a truth you once avoided. Truth may make you tremble at first, but it does not break you. Only pretense exhausts you until you no longer have the strength to stand upright. When you begin to set boundaries, you notice something else. Peace does not return with noise. It does not come through long conversations, careful explanations, repeated efforts to be fully understood. Peace returns when you stop explaining so much. Before, you thought that if you did not say enough, others would misunderstand you. But I tell you that when you stand in truth, you do not need to justify yourself. Truth holds you. It does not need to be defended with hundreds of words. I see very clearly the moments when you type and delete. Type and delete. You compose a long message in your mind, then wonder if you are making too much of it. You soften your words to sound gentler, more agreeable, less likely to provoke a reaction. You do not do this out of deceit. You do it because you fear that if you speak exactly as your heart knows, you will lose approval. But I tell you that every time you erase truth in order to keep the peace, you push your own peace a little farther away. When you begin to speak less, but more truthfully, you feel lighter. Not everything is resolved immediately, but you no longer feel that you must strain yourself to keep everything from falling apart. You do not need to explain why you need rest, why you cannot continue in the old rhythm, why you need time. You simply need to stand in what you know to be true. And in that standing, I am with you not so that you win, but so that you do not dissolve. I tell you that there are times when you need to step back, not to punish anyone, not to make them feel the loss, but so you can hear me more clearly again. When you are too close, everything overlaps, and truth becomes tangled with fear. Distance is not always separation. Sometimes it is light. When you step back just a little, light has room to fall on things that were previously hidden beneath dense emotion. You see this inner struggle very clearly within yourself. One part of you feels regret because you were accustomed to the old rhythm, accustomed to always having someone to worry about. Another part of you feels afraid because you do not know who you will be if you are no longer in the role of the one who is always available. But I do not force you to cut things off. I invite you to step back just enough to discern. That step back is not cold. It is gentle. It gives you space to breathe, to hear again the inner voice you have long drowned out with the noise of constant effort. I tell you that distance does not kill love if that love is real. It only reveals what has been living off constant closeness. There are relationships that exist only as long as you have no boundaries. And when you begin to put a roof over your heart, those relationships feel uncomfortable. I do not say this to frighten you, but to help you understand that the discomfort is not your fault. It is simply a sign that you are living differently. When you step back with gentleness, without bitterness, without retaliation, you begin to sense a very new kind of peace. Not peace because everything has been resolved, but peace because you are no longer betraying yourself in order to keep the peace. You stand more upright in your own body. You breathe more deeply. You no longer have to anticipate every reaction in order to prepare your defenses. I call this peace with a door, doors that open at the right time, doors that close in the right place. I do not require you to be perfect in setting boundaries. I know there are days when you still return to explaining more than necessary, still soften yourself out of fear of making someone uncomfortable. I do not blame you. You are learning a new way of loving, but each time you choose to speak a little more truthfully, to stop a little sooner, to step back in order to hear me more clearly, you are strengthening that roof. And under that roof, your love no longer leaks. It is warm, it is real, and it is enough for you to remain without losing yourself. Once you begin to build that roof over your heart, you realize something very different from what you once assumed. Peace does not return through long conversations, nor does it arrive after everyone has finally understood you. It returns very quietly, almost without notice. In the moment you stop trying so hard to explain. Before, whenever you set even a small boundary, you immediately felt the need to attach reasons, context, background, as if without them, the boundary would become unreasonable or cruel. You were accustomed to proving that you were not bad, not selfish, not ungrateful. But I tell you that truth does not need a lengthy defense in order to stand. When you stand in truth, it stands on its own, even when others are not yet ready to accept it. I see clearly the moments when you type and then erase. You write a truthful sentence, reread it, and feel it is too direct. You soften it. You read it again and feel it is still sharp. You delete it and rewrite, adding words to make it sound gentler, so the other person will not be hurt, so no one will misunderstand. You believe you are doing the right thing for harmony. But I tell you that every time you erase a portion of the truth to preserve surface calm, you tighten your own heart a little more. Peace cannot live in that tension. When you stop explaining so much, you feel empty at first. You are used to your words being understood, acknowledged. When you speak less, you fear others will assign meanings to you that you never intended. But I tell you that not every misunderstanding needs to be corrected immediately. Some misunderstandings dissolve on their own when you continue to live in your truth without defensiveness. Others exist only because you have grown accustomed to using words to maintain calm instead of using presence. You begin to realize that peace does not require you to win a conversation. It requires you to be faithful to what you know is true. When you say, "I can't," without adding a long justification, your heart races for a moment. You fear the reaction on the other side. Then you discover that whatever that reaction may be, you are still standing. You do not collapse. You do not disappear. And that small experience teaches you that boundaries are not as dangerous as you once believed. I tell you that truth has a holding power of its own. It does not hold by forcing others to understand immediately. It holds by not requiring you to distort yourself in order to be accepted. When you stop explaining, you do not become silent, you become clear. Clarity is not speaking a lot, it is knowing when to speak and when to stop. And when you stop in the right place, you allow truth to do its work. There are times when you notice that others react more strongly when you speak less. This confuses you. Before, you spoke at length and things were still tense. Now, you speak less and the tension becomes more visible. I tell you this is not because your boundaries are creating the problem, but because boundaries reveal what was already there. When you no longer cover things with explanations, you allow truth to take shape. And that taking shape, though uncomfortable, is still a good thing. I see you beginning to learn how to remain still after speaking truth. Before, whenever you said something difficult, you immediately followed it by scanning reactions, revising your words, sending another message to soften the impact. Now, you speak and then you stop. You breathe. You allow the space to exist without filling it. That space makes you tremble. But it also shows you that you do not need to do anything more in order to remain in truth. I am there, in that space, holding you so that you do not fall. I tell you that when you stop over-explaining, you are learning to trust truth more than your ability to persuade. You once believed that if you spoke skillfully enough, everything would be fine. But I am showing you that there are things that become fine only when you stop trying to make them fine. Peace does not come from controlling how others understand you. Peace comes from no longer allowing others' misunderstandings to determine your worth or your inner rest. You begin to feel a very unfamiliar freedom. Not freedom from all relationships, but freedom from constantly adjusting yourself to maintain harmony. You still care. You still listen. But you no longer automatically sacrifice your truth to avoid conflict. I call this mature freedom. It is not loud. It is not rebellious. It is simply steady. I tell you that boundaries do not need to be defended with hardness. They are protected through consistency. When you live in alignment with what you have said, others will gradually understand, whether they agree or not. And if someone cannot remain when you live consistently, I do not call that failure. I call it discernment taking place. Not every relationship can live under the roof of truth. When you stop over-explaining, you also stop over-blaming yourself. You no longer replay every sentence to ask whether you did something wrong. You know you spoke truthfully, with respect, without malice, and that is enough. That enough brings you a very new kind of peace, a peace that does not require constant validation. Peace with a door that opens so you can love, a door that closes so you can be kept. And within that rhythm of opening and closing, you begin to live lighter, freer, and calmer in a way you have never known before. There are moments when I invite you to take one step back, and in that very instant, A feeling rises within you that is hard to name. It is not quite fear, and not quite regret, but a quiet inner tension between what you are familiar with and where I am leading you. You have grown used to being very close, used to always being present, always available, always making sure the distance is never wide enough for you to have to face yourself. When I say, step back, you hear it as though I am taking something away, when in truth, I am returning to you what you lost long ago, the ability to hear my voice again without it being drowned out by too many other voices. I tell you that stepping back is not a punishment. It is not a way of punishing others for hurting you, nor a way of punishing yourself for having loved wrongly. Stepping back is a very gentle, very lucid act, in which you acknowledge that you need space to discern. When you are too close, everything overlaps: their emotions, your reactions, old fears, old hopes. In that dense closeness, truth dissolves. Distance, in my hands, is not separation, it is light. Light does not create truth, but it reveals it. When you step back, you begin to see more clearly what is being sustained by your constant presence, and what truly has roots of its own. There are connections that exist because of familiarity, because you are always there to regulate, to keep the rhythm, to compensate. When you step back, that rhythm changes, and you fear everything will collapse. But I tell you that if a relationship can only stand when you have no boundaries, then what is standing there is not enduring love, but a quiet dependency. I see the grief in you very clearly. You grieve the long conversations, the feeling of being needed, the familiar role of the one who is always present. That grief is not wrong. It simply shows how much of yourself you invested. But I tell you, this grief does not mean you must go back. You can grieve and still move forward. You can remember without returning to the old position. Maturity does not erase memory. It places memory in its proper place, so it no longer controls you. When you step back, there are days when you feel empty, not because you have lost everything, but because you are no longer busy keeping everything running. That emptiness unsettles you. You once filled it with messages, with thoughts, with strained prayers. Now, when you do not fill it, you begin to hear your own breathing more clearly. And within that breathing, I begin to speak things you could not hear when you were too close to everything else. I tell you that stepping back requires a kind of decisiveness that is very soft. Not the decisiveness of anger, and not the decisiveness of despair. It is the decisiveness of someone who knows what they need in order to remain whole. You do not slam the door. You simply close it gently, just enough so the wind does not rush in and chill you further. And in that gentle closing, you do not carry bitterness. You carry truth. You are afraid that if you step back, others will think you no longer love. I tell you that love is not measured by physical proximity or by frequency of presence. Love is measured by whether you are still living truthfully within it. There are times when closeness is love. There are times when stepping back is also love, if that stepping back keeps you from losing yourself. I do not call that selfishness. I call it wisdom, born from having learned the cost of living without boundaries. When you allow distance to exist, you begin to see clearly things you once did not dare to look at. You see how you made yourself smaller to fit expectations. You see the times you were silent not because you were gentle, but because you were afraid. You see the times you stayed not because you were called, but because you could not bear the thought of being left. The light of distance is not comfortable, but it is honest. And truth, though it may make you tremble at first, is the only thing that can heal you at the root. I tell you that stepping back is not a permanent state. It is an interval long enough for you to hear me again, bright enough for you to discern, quiet enough for you to stand upright. Once you are standing upright, you may step closer again if that is what is right, but you will step closer in a different posture, no longer bent, no longer bracing, no longer trading peace for closeness. You return as one who is covered, no longer standing exposed in the rain. There are days when you still waver. You step back and then want to move forward again. You miss, and then remind yourself why you need this distance. I do not blame you. You are learning a new rhythm. That rhythm is not steady at first, but each time you choose not to return merely to soothe an old fear, you are strengthening your sacred boundary a little more. And that boundary does not make you lonely. It makes you safe. I tell you that peace does not disappear when you step back. It simply changes location. Before, you searched for peace in constant closeness. Now, you begin to find peace in clarity, clarity about what you can give, clarity about what you must keep, clarity that you no longer have to remain where you are being worn down in order to prove that you love enough. That peace is not loud. It is quiet. It is deep. And it remains. When you step back to hear me again, you do not leave love. You leave the confusion between love and fear. Distance becomes light. And in that light you see yourself more clearly. You see others more clearly. And you see me more clearly, not as one who pushes you away, but as one who stands close enough to hold you, even when you need to step back from what once caused you to lose yourself. There is a powerful moment when I touch the root, and you feel as though the ground beneath your feet shakes, not because I say something new, but because I name what you have avoided for too long. I tell you that there is a part of you that believes you are loving them, but more deeply, you are loving the feeling of being needed. That feeling gives you a place, gives you a reason to stay, gives you proof that you are not invisible. When I name this, your heart tightens, because you fear that if it is true, your love will be judged as impure. But I do not speak to diminish you. I speak to free you from a hunger that has been quietly governing you. You have grown accustomed to being needed. When someone seeks you, leans on you, unravels because of you, you feel valuable. You do not call it dependence, you call it attachment. But I show you that when the feeling of being needed becomes your source of life, you begin to love from lack, not from fullness. You fear that if they no longer need you, you will disappear. And so, you strive to remain indispensable, always available, always understanding, always there. I do not blame you. I know you learned to survive this way in seasons when you were not clearly chosen. I tell you that I heal this part not by cutting away your capacity to love, but by restoring your identity. You were not created to live by being chosen over and over again by others. You were chosen by me before anyone ever saw you, before you had a role, before you had contributions, before you became useful to anyone. I had already chosen you. That choosing was not based on whether you were needed. It was grounded in my eternal love. When this truth touches you, you do not stand firm immediately. You break. That breaking is not loud. It is like a long-held tension within you, suddenly loosening, exposing a very deep sorrow. Sorrow because you realize you have lived for years trying to become indispensable. Sorrow because you equated your presence with how much others needed you. Sorrow because you feared that if you were no longer chosen, you would no longer be anyone. I do not stand at a distance when you break. I hold you in that very breaking. and I do not rush to mend it. There are parts that are healed only when they are allowed to dissolve in my presence. I tell you that being chosen by me is not an idea for you to understand, but a foundation for you to stand on. When you stand on that ground, you no longer have to compete for a place in another's heart. You no longer have to prove that you are worth keeping. You no longer live waiting to see whether today you are still needed. You can love without needing to be needed, and that is a very different kind of love, free, unforced, and whole. As this identity begins to settle into you, you recognize something else every time you ask me to change them while your heart trembles. It is not a sign of weak faith. It is a sign that fear is speaking. I do not push that fear away. I invite you to return and ask yourself, what am I afraid of? Not to accuse yourself, but to name it. Fear does not lose its power when you fight it. It loses its power when you call it by its true name. At times you realize that what you fear is not that they will not change, but that if they do change, you will no longer be chosen. At other times you see that you fear the emptiness that might open if you no longer carry the role of rescuer, the role of holder, the role of making everything okay. These realizations unsettle you for a moment. You feel exposed, as though familiar motives have been stripped away. But I tell you that this nakedness is not dangerous when you are in me. It is simply the place where truth can breathe. When you name fear accurately, it begins to quiet, not because it disappears immediately, but because it no longer governs you from the shadows. You can say, I am afraid of being abandoned. And that sentence does not make you smaller. It makes you real. When you are real, I have room to touch you. And when I touch you, fear is no longer master. It becomes something that is held, not something that pulls. I tell you that I do not promise you will not feel sorrow in this process. Sorrow is inevitable when you leave behind old sources of life. But I promise you will not be consumed by sorrow. There is a kind of sorrow that belongs to captivity, where sorrow blocks every exit and suffocates you. And there is a kind of sorrow that belongs to those who are stepping out, where sorrow walks with light and does not keep you in darkness. I am leading you into the second kind. You will grieve when you realize how much value you placed on being chosen. You will ache when you see how deeply you feared loss. But within that sorrow, you are not alone. I am there not to push you forward faster, but to walk with you step by step, and gradually you will see that sorrow is no longer a pit. It becomes a path. You walk through it not to return to what was, but to cross into a new ground. As I heal this root, you begin to sense a very new freedom. You no longer need to check whether you are still chosen. You no longer live waiting for another's gaze to confirm that you exist. You know, not because you are stronger, but because you have been restored to your original identity. You are one whom I have chosen. And from that place, you begin to love differently. I do not say that the addiction to being chosen will disappear overnight. Old habits will still knock at the door. But each time you return to this truth that you were chosen first, held first, loved first, you weaken the grip of that addiction. And little by little, you will find yourself loving more lightly, more cleanly, no longer from fear, but from a fullness that is growing within you. There is a familiar sign I recognize whenever you ask me to change them, and you feel it in your own body as well. Your heart trembles, not trembling with reverence, but with anxious anticipation. You speak words that are right and beautiful, yet inside you are not at rest. You wait for a signal, a confirmation, a change swift enough for you to exhale. I do not dismiss that prayer. I gently lead you back to a question you often avoid. What am I afraid of? I tell you that fear does not always appear in obvious forms. It does not always say, I am afraid of being abandoned. Sometimes it wears the clothing of zeal, perseverance, sacrifice. It makes you pray more, think harder, hold tighter. But if you become still enough to listen, you will hear beneath every request an old concern. If this does not change, I will lose something very important, and it is that concern that makes your heart tremble. I do not ask you this question to push you into self-analysis or self-condemnation. I ask because any fear that remains unnamed retains authority. It drives you by reflex, by tension, by the urgency to fix. But when you pause and name it correctly, fear loses its greatest advantage, darkness. A fear that is named is no longer a vague force. It becomes something that can be touched, something that can be placed before me. At times, when you ask yourself what you are afraid of, the answer comes quickly and unsettles you. You are afraid of being left alone. You are afraid of no longer being needed. You are afraid that if they change, there may no longer be room for you. You are afraid that if they do not change, you will have to face a truth you are not yet ready to face. These answers make you tremble, because they are not as noble as your original prayer. But I tell you that beauty is not found in hiding fear. It is found in bringing it into the light. When you name fear truthfully, you realize it is not as large as you imagined. It is still there, but it no longer dominates every decision. You can say, I am afraid of being abandoned, and still breathe. You can still stand. You do not dissolve. That experience matters, because it teaches you that fear does not have the authority to define you. It is only a signal that some part of you is asking to be held. I tell you that every time you pray with a trembling heart, that is not the moment to pray harder. It is the moment to draw nearer to me, not to ask for more, but to remain. When you remain with the question, what am I afraid of? You shift from a mode of control into a mode of listening. And in that listening, I am able to touch the root rather than merely treating the surface. You have grown accustomed to thinking that strong faith means not being afraid, but I tell you that true faith is the courage to look fear straight in the face without letting it drive you. When you deny fear, it takes the wheel from behind. When you name it, you place it before me. And there, it no longer gets to decide. It becomes something that can be held, not something that must be avoided. I see you learning this very clearly in the moments when you pause in the middle of prayer. Before, you prayed continuously, as if stopping would cause everything to collapse. Now there are times when you finish praying and fall silent, not because you have run out of words, but because you are listening. You hear your own breathing. You feel your heart tremble, and you do not rush to fix that feeling. You let it remain there, before me. That is a very deep shift. I tell you that when you name fear correctly, you also begin to distinguish between a healthy longing and a defensive motive. You can still desire that they change. I do not take that away from you, but that desire is no longer stretched tight by fear. It becomes softer, more honest. You no longer place your entire life on the outcome of a prayer. You place your life in my hands first, and only then do you lay your longing down. There are days when you realize that you pray less, but more deeply. You do not repeat the same request in tension. You speak what you hope for, and then you speak what you fear. And when you name your fear, you do not find me withdrawing. On the contrary, you sense me nearer. For I am not looking for a soul without fear. I am looking for a soul that is real, I tell you that fear, once it is named, does not disappear immediately, but it changes position. It no longer sits in the driver's seat. It moves to the side, like a trembling child in need of being held. And I, not you, am the one who holds it. When you allow me to do that, you no longer have to expend energy trying to calm yourself at all costs. You are released from the role of having to make yourself okay by force. Gradually, you begin to find yourself steadier in situations that once sent you into panic, not because they have become easier, but because you are no longer swept away at once. There is now a pause between emotion and action. In that pause, you hear my voice ask, "What are you afraid of?" And the moment that question arises, you are no longer completely carried off. I do not rush this process. I know there are fears that have walked with you for a very long time, bound to losses that were very real. But each time you name fear, instead of running from it, you take another step out from under its control, and those small steps are building a new foundation for you, the foundation of someone who can be afraid without being ruled by fear, who can pray without trembling, who can love without trading away their own life in order to keep someone else. There is a promise I have never spoken to you before, and today I want you to hear it clearly. I do not promise that you will not be sad. I do not promise that when you step out of old attachments, your heart will become light immediately, or that memories will fall silent. I do not promise that sorrow will avoid you as it avoids someone strong enough, but I promise something else. Deeper and truer, you will not be swallowed by sorrow. You will grieve as someone who is stepping out, not as someone who is trapped. Before, every time you were sad, you were afraid. You feared that the sadness would pull you back to the old place, soften you, make you doubt everything I had illuminated. You were used to a kind of sorrow that suffocated, sorrow with no exit, sorrow that forced you to find shelter immediately, even if that shelter had once wounded you. I know you lived many years with that kind of sorrow. So when I did not take sorrow away, you became confused. You wondered whether I was truly healing you at all. I tell you that not all sorrow is the same. There is a sorrow born from being held too long in a space without light. That sorrow clings, pulls you in circles, and exhausts you. But there is also a sorrow born from stepping out of a place that was once familiar. That sorrow hurts, but it moves. It does not imprison you, it walks with you toward the light. I am leading you into this second kind of sorrow. When you begin to step away from chosen addiction, you will grieve. You will grieve because you are no longer fed by the feeling of being needed in the same way. You will grieve because there are days when you no longer hear the familiar call. You will grieve because emptiness appears where there was once so much noise. I do not see those days as regression. I see them as a sign that you are no longer defining yourself by being necessary. When an addiction is cut off, the body trembles. The soul does too. I tell you that this sorrow is not your enemy. It is a sign that you are separating yourself from a false source of life. If you rush to silence it, you will very quickly return to what is familiar. But if you stay with this sorrow without dressing it up, without assigning blame, without seeking a quick escape, you will discover that it does not have the claws you once imagined. It hurts, but it does not hold you. It passes, because you are moving. There are mornings when you wake up and feel your heart heavy. There is no new event, no clear memory, surfacing only a sense of lack. Before, you would quickly ask, "Who am I missing?" Now, I invite you to ask differently, "What am I leaving?" That question changes the direction of sorrow. It is no longer a call to return, but a confirmation that you are leaving a way of living driven by fear. I tell you that the sorrow of someone who is stepping out has one very important mark. It does not make you lose your way. You can be sad, but you are not confused. You no longer confuse remembering with needing to go back. You can miss a voice, a familiar rhythm, an old rule, and still know that returning is not healing. This sorrow does not persuade you that it wasn't that bad before. It simply acknowledges that leaving what is familiar always has a cost. I know there are times when you wonder if you are still sad. Have you truly been healed? I tell you that healing is not the loss of the ability to grieve. Healing is the loss of the ability to be imprisoned by grief. You still cry, but you do not sink. You still hurt, but you do not lose yourself. You still remember, but you no longer hand control back to memory. That difference is profound, and you only see it clearly once you have walked far enough. I tell you that I am with you in this sorrow, not as one who rushes to wipe away tears so you will stop, but as one who stands beside you so you are not alone. There are moments when you are sad and do not know what to ask for. I do not call that weak faith. I call it the moment when you no longer use prayer to escape feeling. You remain and I remain with you. That remaining heals you far more deeply than quick explanations ever could. You will begin to realize that this sorrow does not demand that you return in order to be at peace. It allows you to grieve and still be at peace. Those two things once could not coexist within you. Now they are beginning to stand side by side. You can be sad and still breathe deeply. You can hurt and still not panic. You can remember and still not run. That is the sign that you are no longer confined. I tell you that freedom does not mean the absence of heavy emotions. Freedom is when heavy emotions no longer decide the direction of your life. Before, sadness would pull you back. Now, sadness walks with you for a while and then stays behind. You keep moving forward not because you have become hardened, but because you know where you are going. I do not lead you by taking sorrow away. I lead you by placing a path through it. There are days when the sadness feels lighter, and days when it feels heavy again. I do not measure your progress by the smoothness of your emotions. I measure it by whether you are still being dragged back into your former identity, and day by day, even slowly, you are standing more firmly in this truth. You do not need to be chosen in order to exist. You do not need to be needed in order to have worth. I have chosen you, and that choosing is not withdrawn when you are sad. I tell you that a time will come when you look back at this sorrow with a different gaze, not the gaze of someone who has forgotten, but of someone who has passed through. You will see that the very sorrow that did not consume you taught you what is true. It taught you that you can lose an old source of life without losing yourself. It taught you that light does not come only when you are joyful, but also when you are brave enough to remain with pain without betraying the truth. I do not promise that you will never feel sorrow, but I promise you that this sorrow is in its rightful place. It is not a prison. It is a corridor, and you are walking through it, not rushing, not running, but not turning back. I am here, walking with you, so that each step you take in sorrow does not pull you down, but leads you out of the place where you were confined for far too long. There was a time when you waited for a miracle in a very familiar way. You waited for them to change. You waited for the day they would understand. Soften. Choose rightly. Speak rightly. Stay rightly. You called that hope, but I saw that within that hope was a very fine tension, so tight that one opposing sign was enough to steal your peace. And then one day, not because they suddenly became better, but because you were weary of waiting in strain, I began to do something different. I did not touch them first. I touched the way you were standing in this life. I tell you that a miracle is not the moment circumstances change color, but the moment circumstances no longer steer your soul. You remain in the same life, with the same people, the same limits, but what has changed is where you place your weight. Before, every reaction from them was a jolt. Now, those reactions still come, but they no longer knock you down. You do not notice this immediately. You only sense that you are less tired, less panicked, less braced for the worst, and that very small less is the sign of a miracle quietly unfolding. There is a moment when you are surprised to realize that you no longer need them to improve in order for you to have peace that day. Before, your peace depended on their progress. If today they were gentle, you could breathe. If today they were distant, you would shrink. Now, there are days when they are still the same, yet you are no longer pulled along. You are not happy about this. You simply find it strange that you are in the same setting, but your inner rhythm has changed. I tell you that true miracles do not always create upheaval. They often feel like a very subtle shift in rhythm, noticeable only in hindsight. I do not remove your life. I remove its authority over you. You still face difficulty. You still encounter moments of uncertainty. But these things no longer define your entire day. You can feel sorrow for a while and then continue. You can miss a beat and then return. You are no longer swept into a spiral of having to fix immediately, rescue immediately, hold everything together immediately. At times, you feel a quiet tenderness, not because something great has happened, but because you notice that you respond differently. A message arrives, you read it, and your heart does not collapse. A silence appears. You do not immediately accuse yourself. A word touches you. You do not defend yourself as before. You do not call this victory. You simply sense a very deep peace that needs no proof. I tell you that this is what it means to stand within a miracle without applause. I tell you that when you no longer need them to improve in order to have peace, you do not become indifferent. You become free. Freedom does not mean you are no longer affected. It means you are no longer controlled. You still care, but you no longer trade your own life to preserve outward stability. You still hope for good, but you no longer hang your entire future on the change of one person. And it is right there that you begin to taste a kind of peace that does not come from outcomes, but from the place where you are standing. There are days when you look back and wonder, when did I stop waiting for a dramatic shift? When did I stop praying with that tight pull inside? You cannot recall a specific date, because this miracle has no clear milestone. It unfolds in very small choices. You do not reply immediately. You do not explain further. You do not defend yourself. You do not condemn yourself. None of these choices appear particularly spiritual, yet they are quietly reweaving your life from within. I tell you that you are still in process, but this process no longer drains you. You do not need to constantly check whether you are okay. You do not need to measure yourself by how peaceful you feel each day. You only need to notice that life no longer consumes you as it once did. It may touch you, but it does not crush you. It may weary you, but it does not disorient you. And that is the mark of a lasting miracle. At times, you find yourself grateful without knowing exactly for what. Not because they changed, not because circumstances opened up, simply because you are still whole after things that once would have undone you. You see yourself standing in days that would have caused you to collapse before. You do not celebrate loudly. You simply release a long breath, as if your body has finally learned that it no longer needs to remain on high alert. I tell you that I do not despise loud miracles. but I deeply love quiet ones. Because quiet miracles do not make you dependent on emotional peaks. They make you steady in ordinary life. When you change without noise, you do not need someone else to become different in order for you to live rightly. You live rightly because you have been reset into the right place. And from that place, you can face this life without trembling. There are moments when you still ask, "What about them?" I do not avoid that question. I simply return it to its proper place. They have their own journey. You are not called to live it for them. The miracle I am working is not removing them immediately, nor forcing them to change immediately. The miracle is that I am loosening the hook in your heart, the hook that caused every movement of theirs to tug at your soul. When that hook loosens, you may still be there, but you are no longer suspended by it. I tell you that this slowness is not delay. It is a very precise arrangement. If I were to change everything outside before you were reset within, you would return very quickly to your old way of living. But now that your rhythm has changed, that you are standing differently, that you no longer need them to be well in order for you to be at peace, then whatever happens later, you will not be swept away as you once were, and that is a miracle no one clearly sees, yet one you will live inside every day. You do not need to name this miracle. You only need to notice that you are living differently, lighter, slower, truer. And within that difference, I am very near not to perform something dramatic before your eyes, but to protect what is being built within you from being undone by your own urgency. You will not immediately recognize that I am changing you, because I do not do it through dramatic signs. There is no explosive moment, no grand declaration, no day you wake up and find yourself finished. My change enters you like morning light, at first so faint that you even doubt whether it is real. But then you begin to see more clearly, not in your thoughts, but in your reactions. You react differently, and that very difference causes you to slow down and notice. I tell you that the first sign is not that you feel stronger, but that you feel less rushed. Before, the slightest unexpected thing would set your mind running, analyzing, guessing intentions, preparing responses, building defenses. Now there are moments when the same situation happens, yet you do not run. You are able to pause for a beat. That pause is brief, but it is enough to keep you from being pulled away. And within that pause, I am there, not needing to speak loudly, only close enough that you do not panic. You begin to notice this through very ordinary details. You read a message, and your heart does not collapse as before, not because the message is gentler, but because you no longer hang your entire sense of safety on each word. A silence appears, and you do not immediately ask yourself what you did wrong. You hear a tone you did not expect, and you do not rush to justify yourself. You do not call this maturity. You simply feel less tired, and that very relief is the sign of a freedom beginning to take shape. I tell you that where my spirit is, there is freedom. That freedom does not make you careless. It releases you from the need to prove yourself. Before, you lived as if you were always in an invisible trial. You had to prove that you understood, that you were right, that you were good enough, that you deserved to remain. Every response carried a thin but constant layer of defense. Now, as I am changing you from within, you no longer live to prove. You live to be present, and presence does not need to be loud to carry weight. You begin to feel a very quiet confidence, not the confidence of someone who controls outcomes, but the confidence of someone who no longer needs to control outcomes in order to exist. You can enter a conversation without carrying a prepared script. You can hear what is difficult without reacting immediately. You can speak truth without padding it to protect your image. I am not making you reckless. I am making you clear. I tell you that this clarity does not come from understanding everything. It comes from no longer needing to defend yourself constantly. When you are no longer defending, you stop seeing every situation as a threat. You can discern what needs a response and what can be left alone. You no longer react to stay safe, because you are already safe from a deeper place. And from that place, you choose how to respond rather than being dragged by reflex. There are days when you realize you are explaining far less than before, not because you have nothing to say, but because you no longer need to speak in order to survive. You do not need to prove that you are not selfish, not cold, not abandoning anyone. You know where you are standing, and when you know, you do not need to persuade. Persuasion costs energy. Presence does not. You begin to live more from that presence. I see that you are also less afraid, but not in the way you once imagined. Fear still exists, but it no longer stands in front of you, blocking your path. It stands to the side, like a quiet signal that you are stepping into something new. You no longer panic when you notice fear. You no longer use fear as evidence that you are going the wrong way. You simply acknowledge it and continue walking. That difference is profound, though only you may notice it, because it happens at a very deep level. I tell you that when you stop proving your worth, you begin to recover the energy that has been drained from you for years. You no longer spend strength maintaining an image, correcting others' perceptions, ensuring you are not misunderstood. You have room to rest. And when you rest, you hear more clearly. You hear the small guidance that was once drowned out by the noise of anxiety. I do not shout for you to hear me. I whisper, because you are now quiet enough to hear a small voice. There are moments when you look at yourself and feel surprised, not because you have become someone else, but because you have come closer to who you were originally created to be, someone who can be present in a situation without losing themselves. You find yourself smiling more naturally, not to smooth the atmosphere. You find yourself silent more naturally, not from fear of saying the wrong thing. These small things receive no applause, yet they are reweaving your life into a new order. I tell you that this is how I work miracles within you, not by rearranging every circumstance, but by dismantling the inner mechanisms that kept you living in tension for so long. You still face familiar things, but they no longer carry the same authority. You still walk through uncertain days, but you no longer lose yourself in them. And that steadiness does not come from trying harder, but from no longer trying to prove. You will not always recognize what I am doing, but you will recognize that you are living differently, less hurried, less afraid, less defensive, not because you have hardened, but because you are freer. And within that freedom, you do not need to speak much about your transformation. Those close to you will sense it through the way you are present, through the way you are no longer pulled by every small fluctuation. That is the mark of a miracle that is quiet, yet deeply real, continuing to grow within you each day. A very gentle shift has taken place in the way you come to me. Though you may not yet have a name for it, you still ask. You still remember them. You still bring their names before me. But your prayers no longer carry urgency, no longer carry the taste of lack, no longer sound like a plea for me to act immediately so that you will hurt less. You pray from a different place. You pray while standing firm, and it is that stance which changes the substance of your prayer. I tell you that now you no longer pray in order to cling. You pray in order to illuminate. Before, each prayer was like a rope you threw out in fear, hoping to pull them closer so you would not feel empty. Now, your prayer is like a lamp placed in its proper position. It binds no one. It forces no outcome. It simply sheds light on the truth and allows each soul to walk in that light for themselves. You no longer tremble when you pray, because you are no longer wagering your peace on an answer. I tell you that when prayer no longer rises from lack, it becomes very clear. You no longer need me to prove something immediately. You no longer use prayer as a way to hold on to a person, a relationship, or an image. You pray because you love, not because you fear losing. And that is the difference between a mature prayer and a weary one. A mature prayer does not try to control the future. It trusts that I am working in layers you cannot see. You begin to realize that you can pray for them without forgetting yourself. You no longer dissolve after each prayer. You no longer feel as though you have placed your soul on the bargaining table. You pray, and then you rise and continue living your day. You do your part. Love in truth. Keep boundaries. And walk slowly, yet steadily. Prayer is no longer the center of your day. My presence is. I tell you that this is when you begin to understand your will be done in a different way. Before, those words sounded like resignation. You spoke them when you had no more choices, when you felt powerless, when you forced yourself to accept something that hurt. But now, when you say, "Your will be done," your heart no longer contracts. You speak them as one who trusts that I am doing what is good, even when that good does not yet look like what you hope for. I do not teach you surrender so that you will stand still. I teach you surrender so that you are free to act rightly. When you surrender, you do not let go of life. You let go of the illusion that you must control every direction in order to be safe. And when that illusion falls away, you become very clear. You know when to speak and when to be silent, when to step forward and when to stop. Surrender does not make you passive. Surrender makes you lucid. I tell you that a new season is opening, not with trumpets, not with loud signs, but through a change in how you stand before me and before life. You no longer come to me only to ask that another person be fixed. You come to live in union with me. And from that union, you pray for others as something natural, without carrying the burden of needing to see immediate results. You will notice that your prayers feel lighter, but not weaker. They carry no pressure, yet they carry the authority of peace. When you pray from peace, that prayer does not exhaust you. It does not drain your life force. It flows like water from a source that is no longer blocked. And you will be surprised to find that even as you pray for others, you yourself are being nourished. I tell you that from here on, you will walk in a different rhythm. You do not rush the future. You do not cling to the past. You do today's portion with quiet faithfulness. There are things I will do very deeply, very slowly, and very securely. If I showed you everything at once, you would want to intervene again. So I invite you to trust, not blind trust, but trust born of experience. Each time you surrender in the right rhythm, you lose nothing. You are simply returned to yourself. There will be days when your prayers are very short. There will be days when you speak only one sentence and then fall silent. There will be days when you say nothing at all and simply remain in me. Do not be afraid. That is not faith growing cold. That is faith no longer needing many words to stand. I hear even that silence. I am present in it. And in that silence, I am leading you deeper into the new season. I tell you that this new season does not come for you to prove that you have changed. It comes so that you may live differently quietly. Truthfully, you will love without destroying yourself. You will pray without losing yourself. You will surrender without disappearing. You will walk with me not as one clinging in panic, but as one walking alongside, trusting that the path is opening just enough for each step. And when you look back over this entire journey, you will see clearly, I did not remove them to punish you. I did not keep them to test you. I used everything to return you to the right place where you can pray without being pulled apart, love without being trapped, surrender without losing life itself. That is the miracle of maturity. And within that miracle, you are entering a new season, quiet, yet steady, gentle, yet real, and very close to me. Thank you for listening to today's message. Please subscribe and turn on notifications so that together we may receive the living word. Build a firm faith and walk in the boundless love of God. Amen.